The laughter echoed through the dining room as my mother-in-law held up my Christmas gift, barely the size of a jewelry box. "Well, isn't this quaint?" she said, her voice dripping with condescension. My father-in-law chuckled, shaking his head. "I guess some people just can't afford proper gifts." But when my husband Marcus opened that small package and pulled out what was inside, the silence that followed was deafening. What they discovered would change everything they thought they knew about me. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. I should have known the moment I walked into the Whitmore family's sprawling estate in Connecticut that Christmas morning would be a disaster. The mansion stood like something out of a magazine, with its perfectly manicured grounds and imported marble steps leading to doors that probably cost more than most people's cars. This was my second Christmas with Marcus's family, and I still felt like an outsider looking through bulletproof glass. Marcus squeezed my hand as we approached the front door, both of us carrying carefully wrapped presents. "Remember what we talked about, Sarah? Just be yourself," he whispered, though we both knew that being myself had never been enough for Eleanor and Richard Whitmore. Eleanor answered the door wearing a cream-colored cashmere ensemble that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Her perfectly styled silver hair didn't move an inch as she air-kissed both my cheeks, her smile as cold as the December wind. "Sarah, dear, how nice to see you again." Richard appeared behind her, adjusting his expensive watch with the kind of casual arrogance that comes from generational wealth. "Marcus, son, come in, Sarah." He nodded curtly in my direction, his acknowledgement feeling more like an obligation than genuine warmth. The interior of their home was even more intimidating than I remembered. Crystal chandeliers caught the morning light, casting rainbow patterns across walls adorned with original paintings that belonged in museums. Every surface gleamed with the kind of cleanliness that only comes from having a full staff of housekeepers. Marcus's sister Victoria was already there with her husband Brad and their twin boys, who were currently terrorizing their grandmothers. Priceless Persian rugs. Victoria worked in investment banking and never let anyone forget it, especially not me with my job as a high school teacher. "Oh, Sarah!" Victoria exclaimed, rushing over in her designer heels. "I was just telling Mother about the most amazing vacation Brad and I took to Switzerland last month. The 5-star resort was absolutely divine. You and Marcus should really treat yourselves to something like that sometime." Her tone suggested she knew perfectly well that teachers and social workers couldn't afford Swiss 5-star resorts. "That sounds lovely," I replied, forcing a smile. Marcus worked for a nonprofit organization helping veterans transition back to civilian life. It was meaningful work that paid practically nothing, which was another source of disappointment for his parents who had expected their Harvard-educated son to follow his father into investment banking. Eleanor clapped her hands together. "Well, shall we move to the living room? I'm simply dying to see what everyone brought this year." The living room was a testament to wealth and taste, with furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum and a Christmas tree that must have cost thousands to decorate. Presents were arranged beneath it in neat, expensive-looking piles, each one wrapped with the kind of precision that spoke of professional gift-wrapping services. Richard poured himself a scotch that was probably older than I was, while Eleanor served coffee from what I was certain was genuine china. The twins were already eyeing the presents with barely contained excitement, while Victoria and Brad discussed their latest real estate acquisition. "Now then," Eleanor announced, settling into her chair with theatrical flair. "Who would like to go first?" The gift exchange began with all the pomp and circumstance of a royal ceremony. Victoria presented Eleanor with an antique brooch that had belonged to some European countess, while Brad gave Richard a rare bottle of wine from his private collection. The twins received remote-controlled cars that cost more than most adults' Christmas budgets. When Eleanor unwrapped Marcus's gift, a beautiful leather-bound first edition of her favorite classic novel, she actually seemed pleased for once. "Oh, Marcus, this is wonderful. You always did have such thoughtful taste." Then came my turn. I watched as Eleanor delicately unwrapped the small package I had given her, her expression shifting from curiosity to barely concealed disappointment as she revealed the simple wooden jewelry box inside. "Oh," she said, her voice flat. "How rustic." Richard leaned over to examine it, his expression equally unimpressed. "Did you make this yourself, Sarah?" "Actually, it's handcrafted by a local artisan," I explained, feeling heat rise in my cheeks. "The wood comes from a tree that was over 200 years old and—" "How quaint," Eleanor interrupted, setting the box aside as if it might contaminate her expensive furniture. "I suppose not everyone can afford to shop at proper establishments." Victoria snickered behind her coffee cup, while Brad looked uncomfortable, but said nothing. The twins, bored by the adult conversation, had already returned to playing with their new toys. "Mother," Marcus said quietly, but Eleanor was already moving on. "Well, I suppose we should see what other surprises await us," she said, reaching for another present with exaggerated enthusiasm. But I noticed she kept glancing at my gift with what looked like genuine confusion mixed with her obvious disdain. It was as if she couldn't quite understand why someone would give such a simple, inexpensive present to someone of her stature. The worst part was that I had agonized over that gift for weeks. I had searched for something meaningful, something that would show I understood her love of beautiful things without breaking my teacher's budget. The wooden jewelry box had seemed perfect, elegant in its simplicity, crafted with obvious care and skill. But sitting in that opulent living room, surrounded by gifts that cost more than my monthly salary, my carefully chosen present looked exactly like what Eleanor saw, a cheap trinket from someone who didn't belong in their world. Marcus reached over and squeezed my hand again, his jaw tight with barely controlled anger. I could see him struggling between defending me and avoiding, a family confrontation that would make future gatherings even more unbearable. "Sarah put a lot of thought into that gift, Mother," he said finally, his voice carefully controlled. "I'm sure she did, dear," Eleanor replied with the kind of dismissive sweetness that cut deeper than outright hostility. "It's very earnest." The word hung in the air like an accusation. Earnest. The kind of things simple people did when they didn't understand the sophisticated art of giving appropriate gifts. As the morning wore on and the gift exchange continued, I found myself sinking deeper into my chair, wishing I could disappear entirely. Every expensive present that was unwrapped felt like another reminder of how little I belonged in this world of casual wealth and inherited privilege. But then something unexpected happened. Marcus's youngest nephew, 8-year-old Tyler, wandered over to where Eleanor had set aside my gift. While the adults continued their conversations about stock portfolios and vacation homes, Tyler picked up the wooden box and began examining it with the kind of intense curiosity that only children possess. "This is really pretty," he said, running, his small fingers over the smooth wood grain. "What's it for?" Eleanor barely glanced in his direction. "It's just a little box, darling. Nothing important." But Tyler wasn't satisfied with that explanation. He continued turning the box over in his hands, discovering small details that the adults had missed in their rush to judgment. There were tiny carved flowers along the edges, so delicate they were almost invisible unless you looked closely. The wood had been polished to such a perfect smoothness that it seemed to glow in the morning light. "Can I open it?" Tyler asked. "I suppose," Eleanor said with a sigh, as if even this small interaction with my gift was beneath her dignity. But as Tyler lifted the lid of the small wooden box, something fell out that made everyone in the room freeze. It wasn't jewelry or a small trinket, as everyone had assumed. Instead, a folded piece of paper fluttered to the expensive carpet, landing at Eleanor's perfectly pedicured feet. The room went completely silent, except for the gentle crackling of the fireplace and the distant sound of someone's expensive watch ticking. Even the twins stopped playing with their toys, sensing that something important was happening. Eleanor bent down slowly, her expression shifting from dismissive boredom to genuine curiosity as she picked up the paper and began to unfold it. Her eyes widened as she read the first few lines, and I watched as her face went through a series of expressions I had never seen before. Surprise, confusion, and then something that might have been shock. Richard set down his scotch glass with a sharp clink against the marble side table. "What is it, Eleanor? What does it say?" Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she held the document, her eyes scanning the official letterhead and legal text. The color had drained from her face, leaving her looking pale despite her expensive makeup. She started, then stopped, reading the paper again as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. "It's a property deed." Victoria laughed nervously from across the room. "A property deed? What kind of joke is this?" But Eleanor wasn't laughing. She was staring at the document with an expression I had never seen on her face before, something between bewilderment and what might have been respect. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. "It's for a house," she continued slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "A house on Beacon Hill in Boston." The silence that followed was so complete you could have heard a pin drop on the Persian carpet. Even the twins had stopped playing, sensing the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere. Marcus looked as confused as everyone else. "Sarah, I don't understand. What house on Beacon Hill?" I took a deep breath, feeling every eye in the room focused on me. This was the moment I had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. "It belonged to my grandmother," I said quietly. "She passed away 3 months ago." Richard stood up abruptly, nearly knocking over his chair. "Your grandmother owned property on Beacon Hill? That's impossible. Do you have any idea what real estate costs in that neighborhood?" I did know, actually. I had been learning quite a lot about Boston real estate values over the past few months, ever since my grandmother's lawyer had called to inform me of my inheritance. "The house has been in my family since 1892, I explained, watching as Eleanor continued to study the deed with growing amazement. "My great-great-grandfather bought it when he made his fortune in the shipping business." Victoria's mouth fell open. "Shipping business? What shipping business?" "Morrison Maritime," I said simply. "Perhaps you've heard of it." The effect of those 2 words was immediate and dramatic. Richard actually stumbled backward, catching himself against his chair. Victoria's coffee cup clattered against its saucer. Even Brad, who rarely showed any emotion about anything, looked stunned. Morrison Maritime wasn't just any shipping company. It was one of the oldest and most prestigious maritime firms in New England, with a history dating back to the early days of American trade with Europe and Asia. The Morrison family had been Boston royalty for generations, their name appearing on museum wings and hospital foundations throughout the city. "You're a Morrison?" Eleanor whispered, still clutching the deed. "My maiden name is Morrison. Yes," I replied. "Sarah Elizabeth Morrison." Marcus was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Sarah, why didn't you ever tell me about this? About your family?" I shifted uncomfortably in my chair. This was the conversation I had been avoiding for 2 years. "Because it doesn't matter," I said. My grandmother was estranged from most of the family. She married my grandfather, who was a teacher, and they basically disowned her. She lived, very simply, even though she could have afforded not to. She taught me that money and social status weren't what made a person valuable. Eleanor was shaking her head slowly, as if trying to process information that didn't fit with her understanding of the world. "But this house," she said, looking down at the deed again. "According to this, it's worth—" She trailed off, but Richard finished the sentence for her. "Millions. A historic house on Beacon Hill is worth millions of dollars." The twins had completely abandoned their expensive toys and were now listening to the adult conversation with fascination. Tyler, who had originally opened the box, was beaming as if he had discovered buried treasure. "So Sarah is rich?" he asked with the blunt curiosity of childhood. "Tyler, hush!" Victoria snapped, but she was looking at me with an expression that was entirely different from the condescending pity she had shown earlier. Brad cleared his throat nervously. "Sarah, I have to ask, why are you giving this to us? I mean, to Eleanor?" It was a good question, and one I had wrestled with for weeks after receiving the deed. The truth was complicated, and I wasn't sure I could explain it in a way they would understand. "Because I don't want it," I said finally. "I don't want the house, and I don't want the money it represents. My grandmother left it to me because she knew I would understand what to do with it." Eleanor looked up from the deed, her eyes meeting mine for the first time that morning without any trace of condescension. "What do you mean, what to do with it?" I stood up, feeling more confident than I had all morning. This was my story to tell, and I was going to tell it properly. My grandmother spent the last 30 years of her life volunteering at homeless shelters and food banks. She used her trust fund income to support organizations that helped people who had nowhere else to turn. She could have lived in luxury, but she chose to live modestly so she could give more to others. I walked over to where Eleanor sat, the deed still in her hands. She left me that house with specific instructions. She wanted it to be sold, and the proceeds to be used to establish a foundation that would provide emergency housing for families in crisis, families with children who need a safe place to stay while they get back on their feet. The room was so quiet I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. "But why give the deed to me?" Eleanor asked, her voice smaller than I had ever heard it. "Because you have the connections and the business expertise to make sure it's done right," I said honestly. "You know people who can help establish the foundation properly, who can ensure the money is managed responsibly. You understand the legal and financial aspects in ways that I never could." Richard sat down heavily in his chair, running his hands through his silver hair. "Sarah, do you understand what you're doing? This inheritance could set you up for life. You could quit teaching, travel the world, buy anything you wanted." "I know," I said, "but that's not what would make me happy." "Teaching makes me happy. Helping kids learn and grow makes me happy. Having enough money for a comfortable life makes me happy. Having millions of dollars would just be a burden." Marcus stood up and walked over to me, taking my hands in his. "This is why you've been so stressed lately, isn't it? This is what you've been struggling with." I nodded. "I couldn't figure out how to tell you, how to tell your family without it changing everything. I didn't want people to treat me differently because of money I didn't even want." Eleanor stood up slowly, still holding the deed, and walked over to where I stood with Marcus. "Sarah," she said, and for the first time since I had known her voice was completely sincere. "I owe you an apology, a very significant apology." She looked down at the wooden jewelry box, which Tyler was still examining with fascination. "This box," she continued, "it's beautiful, really beautiful. And the thought behind it? I completely missed the point, didn't I?" I smiled, feeling some of the tension leave my shoulders. "It's okay, Eleanor. I understand why you reacted the way you did." But she was shaking her head. "No, it's not okay. I judged you based on assumptions and prejudices, and I was wrong. Completely wrong." Victoria was pacing now, her designer heels clicking against the marble floor in an agitated rhythm. Wait, she said, holding up her hands. "Let me get this straight. You're telling us that you've been sitting on millions of dollars in real estate and you want to just give it away?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you," I replied calmly. Brad leaned forward in his chair, his investment banker instincts clearly kicking in. Sarah, have you considered the tax implications of this decision? The capital gains alone could be substantial, and establishing a foundation requires a significant legal framework, ongoing management costs, board oversight. Brad, Marcus interrupted, his voice carrying a warning tone. She's not asking for a financial consultation. But I held up my hand. No, it's okay. These are valid concerns, and exactly why I need Eleanor's help. Eleanor was still studying the deed, turning it over in her hands as if it might reveal additional secrets. Tell me more about your grandmother's vision for this foundation. What exactly did she have in mind? I walked over to the massive windows overlooking the Whitmore's perfectly landscaped grounds. In the distance, I could see their tennis court and swimming pool, symbols of a life I had never wanted, but was now in a position to afford. She called it the Morrison Family Emergency Housing Initiative, I began. The idea was to create temporary housing solutions for families facing sudden crises, job loss, medical emergencies, domestic violence situations, natural disasters. Not just a roof over their heads, but comprehensive support to help them stabilize and rebuild. Richard had been unusually quiet, but now he spoke up. How many families are we talking about serving? Based on the projected sale value of the Beacon Hill property and some additional assets, we could potentially help about 50 families per year with 6-month housing assistance packages, I answered. Each package would include temporary housing, job placement services, childcare support, and financial literacy training. The twins had wandered over to listen, their young faces serious as they tried to understand the adult conversation. Tyler was still clutching the wooden jewelry box, treating it like a treasure. Aunt Sarah, he said suddenly, does this mean you're like a superhero who helps people? His innocent question broke some of the tension in the room, and I couldn't help but smile. I don't think I'm a superhero, Tyler. I just want to help families who need it. Eleanor walked over to where I stood by the window. Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. I nodded, prepared for whatever question was coming. Is this some kind of test? Are you doing this to prove something? To us? To Marcus? To yourself? The question caught me off guard because it was more perceptive than I had expected from Eleanor. Maybe partially, I admitted. But mostly, I'm doing it because it's what feels right. My grandmother lived with the weight of inherited wealth for 70 years. She watched her family split apart over money, saw how it corrupted relationships and values. She didn't want that legacy to continue. I turned to face the room, looking at each member of Marcus's family in turn. She wanted the Morrison money to mean something positive for once, to build something instead of just maintaining old privileges. Victoria had stopped pacing and was now sitting on the edge of the sofa, her expression thoughtful. I have to admit, she said slowly, this is not what I expected when I woke up this morning. None of us did, Richard muttered, refilling his scotch glass with shaking hands. Eleanor was reading through the deed again, this time paying attention to details she had missed before. There's something else here, she said, frowning. According to this document, the property transfer isn't just the house itself. It includes several commercial buildings in the Back Bay area and... She paused, her eyes widening. And a significant investment portfolio managed by Hartwell and Associates. Now it was my turn to look confused. I don't know anything about commercial buildings or an investment portfolio. My grandmother's lawyer only mentioned the house. Eleanor looked up at me with an expression that was part amazement, part concern. Sarah, dear, I think you may have underestimated your inheritance. Considerably. Richard practically jumped out of his chair. Hartwell and Associates? They manage portfolios worth tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions. The room began to spin slightly, and I had to sit down. This was not what my grandmother's lawyer had described to me. He had mentioned the house, some personal effects, and a modest trust fund. Nothing about commercial real estate or massive investment portfolios. Marcus sat down beside me, taking my hand. Sarah, are you okay? You look pale. I need to call Mr. Peterson, I said quietly. My grandmother's lawyer. He didn't tell me about any of this. Eleanor was already moving toward her desk in the corner of the room. May I suggest we call him together? I'd like to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with here. Victoria was shaking her head in disbelief. This keeps getting more surreal by the minute. Brad pulled out his phone and started typing, rapidly. I'm looking up recent sales in the Back Bay area. If these are prime commercial properties— Brad, stop, I said firmly. Please, this is already overwhelming enough without running calculations. But Eleanor was already dialing a number on her phone. Mr. Peterson, this is Eleanor Whitmore. I'm calling regarding the Morrison estate. Yes, that's right. I'm here with Sarah and we have some questions about the full extent of her inheritance. I watched Eleanor's face as she listened to whatever Mr. Peterson was telling her. Her expression shifted from curiosity to shock to something that might have been awe. I see, she said finally. And this was all detailed in the original will? Yes, I understand. Thank you. She hung up the phone and turned to face me with an expression I couldn't read. Sarah, she said gently, you need to sit down. I am sitting down. Then you need to sit down more. Richard was hovering nearby, clearly dying to know what she had learned. Eleanor, what did he say? Eleanor took a deep breath before answering. The total value of Sarah's inheritance, including all real estate holdings, investments, and trust funds, is approximately $87 million. The silence that followed was so profound, it seemed to have physical weight. Even the twins stopped fidgeting and stared at the adults with wide eyes. 87 million? Victoria whispered. Eleanor nodded grimly. Mr. Peterson explained that Sarah's grandmother specifically instructed him to reveal the inheritance gradually, starting with just the Beacon Hill property. She was concerned that learning about the full extent all at once might be overwhelming. I felt like I was going to be sick. $87 million? The commercial properties alone are worth about $40 million, Eleanor continued. The investment portfolio has been growing steadily for decades. Your grandmother lived off only a small portion of the annual returns. Marcus was staring at me as if he had never seen me before. Sarah, you're incredibly wealthy. I don't want to be incredibly wealthy, I protested, my voice rising. I wanted to give away one house, not manage a financial empire. Tyler looked up from his wooden box with the kind of innocent wisdom that only children possess. If you have more money, you can help more families, right? His simple observation cut through all the adult complications and fears, reducing the situation to its essential truth. With $87 million, the Morrison Family Emergency Housing Initiative could help thousands of families instead of dozens. Eleanor set down her phone and walked over to where I sat, my head in my hands trying to process the magnitude of what I had just learned. Sarah, she said softly, I know this feels overwhelming, but Tyler is right. This could change thousands of lives. I looked up at her, seeing a completely different person than the woman who had dismissed my gift just an hour earlier. Eleanor, I don't know how to manage $87 million. I can barely balance my own checkbook. That's why you don't do it alone, Richard said, his business instincts clearly overriding his earlier shock. You build a team of professionals, establish proper governance structures, create accountability measures. Victoria had been unusually quiet, but now she spoke up. Sarah, can I ask you something personal? I nodded, bracing myself for whatever was coming. Why teaching? With your family background, you could have done anything, gone anywhere. Why did you choose to work with teenagers? In a public school? It was a fair question, and one I had been asked many times over the years by people who discovered my family name. Because those kids need someone who believes in them, I said simply. Most of my students come from families where no one has Ever gone to college where no one has ever told them they were smart or capable or worthy of big dreams? I wanted to be that person for them. I stood up and walked to the fireplace, staring into the flames as I continued. My grandmother used to tell me stories about her childhood, about how isolated she felt growing up with enormous wealth while most of the world struggled. She said the money became a wall between her and real human connection. She didn't want that for me. Marcus joined me by the fireplace. Is that why you never told me about your family? I turned to face him, seeing hurt and confusion in his eyes. I was afraid you would change. That everyone would change. That people would see the money instead of seeing me. But you were planning to give it all away anyway, he pointed out. I was planning to give away one house, I corrected. Now we're talking about managing a fortune that could fund housing programs across multiple states. Brad had been quiet throughout most of this conversation, but now he cleared his throat. Sarah, from a practical standpoint, you're going to need to make some immediate decisions. The estate taxes alone on an inheritance of this size. How much? I asked, dreading the answer. He pulled out his phone calculator and did some quick math. Roughly $35 million, due within 9 months of your grandmother's death. The number hit me like a physical blow. $35 million? I don't have $35 million in cash. Which is why you can't just ignore this or wish it away, Eleanor said gently. Like it or not, you're now responsible for managing significant financial assets. The question is whether you're going to do it thoughtfully or let it overwhelm you. Tyler wandered over with his wooden box, looking up at me with curious eyes. Are you sad about getting all that money? His question was so direct, so innocent, that it cut through all the adult complications and forced me to confront the truth. I'm scared, Tyler, I admitted. I'm scared that having this much money will change who I am. But you're still the same person who gave Grandma Eleanor the pretty box, he said. The money didn't change the box. Out of the mouths of babes. His simple observation made more sense than all the adult analysis and worry. Eleanor sat down in her chair and gestured for me to join her. Sarah, let me tell you something about money that took me many years to learn. Money itself is neither good nor evil. It's a tool. The question is what you do with that tool. She looked around the opulent room with its expensive furniture and priceless art. Richard and I have been fortunate in our business ventures. We've made a lot of money over the years, but we've also tried to use some of that money responsibly, supporting the arts, funding scholarships, contributing to medical research. Not because we're particularly virtuous people, but because we recognized an obligation. Richard nodded in agreement. Your grandmother understood that obligation. She spent decades figuring out how to use her wealth to make a positive difference. Now she's passing that responsibility to you. Victoria leaned forward. What if we helped? What if this became a family project? We could establish the foundation properly, create professional management structures, ensure proper oversight. I looked at her in surprise. You would want to do that? Sarah, an hour ago I thought you were... She paused, clearly struggling with how to phrase her earlier prejudice diplomatically. I thought you didn't understand our world. But now I realize you understand it better than any of us. You see the responsibility that comes with wealth, not just the privilege. Brad was nodding enthusiastically. The legal and financial infrastructure for something like this would be complex, but it's absolutely doable. We could create a multi-generational foundation with professional management and family oversight. What about your own careers? I asked. Your own lives? Victoria smiled. The first genuine smile I had ever seen from her. Sarah, I spend my days managing investments for people who already have more money than they could spend in 10 lifetimes. The opportunity to use those same skills to actually help people in need? That would be incredibly meaningful. Eleanor was studying the deed again, but now her expression was thoughtful rather than shocked. We would need to move carefully, establish the foundation properly, create clear mission statements and operating procedures, build relationships with existing social service organizations. And we would need to visit the properties, Richard added, understand what we're actually dealing with in terms of real estate assets. I felt a strange mixture of relief and terror. Relief that I wouldn't have to navigate this alone. Terror at the magnitude of what we were contemplating. There's something else, I said slowly. Something Mr. Peterson mentioned that I didn't really understand at the time. Everyone looked at me expectantly. He said my grandmother had been working on this foundation idea for years. She apparently has detailed plans, research, even preliminary contacts with social service organizations in Boston and other cities. Eleanor's eyes lit up. She was preparing the groundwork for you. It sounds like it. Mr. Peterson said there are boxes of documents and planning materials at her house that I haven't gone through yet. Marcus squeezed my hand. Then maybe we should go look at those documents, all of us. I looked around the RI room at these people who, just hours earlier, had seemed like adversaries. Now they were offering to help me shoulder a responsibility I had never asked for but couldn't ignore. You would really do this? Help me build something this big? Eleanor stood up and walked over to where I sat. For the first time since I had known her, she took my hands in hers with genuine warmth. Sarah, dear, you gave me a gift this morning that I completely misunderstood. You weren't just giving me a jewelry box. You were offering to trust me with something incredibly important. She looked down at the deed, then back at my face. The least I can do is prove worthy of that trust. Tyler held up his wooden box, beaming with pride. Can I help too? I found the secret paper. Victoria laughed, a real laugh, not the artificial sound I was used to hearing from her. Tyler, you absolutely can help. This is going to be a family project. And for the first time since Mr. Peterson's phone call 3 months earlier, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I could handle what my grandmother had left me. 3 days later, I found myself standing in front of my grandmother's house on Beacon Hill with the entire Whitmore family. The Georgian-style mansion looked exactly as I remembered from my childhood visits. Red brick, white shutters, and an elegant front door that had welcomed generations of Morrisons. What I hadn't remembered was how imposing it would feel to hold the key to something worth $40 million. Sarah, are you ready? Marcus asked gently, noticing my hesitation on the front steps. Tyler was practically bouncing with excitement beside me. Can we see where the secret papers are hidden? Eleanor smiled at his enthusiasm. Tyler, patience. We need to be respectful. This was someone's home for many years. I turned the key in the lock, and the door opened with a soft creak that brought back memories of summer afternoons spent in my grandmother's garden, learning about plants and listening to her stories about the family's complicated history. Chaturi. Interior of the house was exactly as I remembered, elegant but comfortable, filled with antique furniture that had been lovingly maintained rather than displayed for show. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. It's beautiful, Victoria whispered, running her hand along a mahogany banister that probably dated back to the house's original construction. But it was Richard who noticed what the rest of us had missed. Sarah, look at the walls. I followed his gaze and realized that what I had always assumed were decorative family portraits were actually something much more significant. The walls were lined with photographs and newspaper clippings documenting decades of charitable work, soup kitchen openings, homeless shelter ribbon cuttings, foundation ceremonies. She kept records of everything, I said, walking closer to examine the display. Eleanor was studying a photograph from 1987 showing my grandmother cutting a ribbon at what appeared to be a family housing complex. Margaret Morrison Foundation. Housing Initiative, she read from the caption. Sarah, your grandmother wasn't just planning to start a foundation. She'd already been running one. My legs suddenly felt weak, and I had to sit down on a nearby chair. She never told me about any of this. Marcus knelt beside me, pointing to another photograph. Look at this one. It's dated last year. The image showed my grandmother, frailer than I remembered but still smiling, standing with a young mother and her 2 children in front of a modest apartment building. The caption read, "Morrison Foundation assists 200th family with emergency housing. Placement. 200 families," Brad said quietly. She was already helping 200 families, and we never knew. Tyler had wandered into what appeared to be a study and was calling from the other room. There's a whole wall of books about helping. People! We followed his voice and found ourselves in my grandmother's private office. The room was lined floor to ceiling with books about social work, housing policy, nonprofit management, and community development. Her desk was covered with neat stacks of papers, all organized with the precision of someone who had been preparing for an important transition. Eleanor walked over to the desk and picked up a leather-bound folder marked, "For Sarah," in my grandmother's distinctive handwriting. "I think we found what we came looking for," she said, holding up the folder. Inside were dozens of documents: foundation bylaws, financial reports, property assessments, program evaluations, and detailed plans for expansion. But what struck me most was a handwritten letter addressed to me personally. "My dearest Sarah," I read aloud, my voice shaking slightly. "If you are reading this, then I have finally found the courage to entrust you with the work that has defined my life for the past 30 years. I paused, looking around at the faces surrounding me, people who had become my partners in this unexpected journey. You have always possessed the heart for this work, even as a child when you would insist on giving away your toys to children who had less. But I wanted you to choose this path freely, not because of obligation or family pressure." Victoria had tears in her eyes. She was protecting you, letting you find your own way to this decision. I continued reading. "The Morrison Foundation has quietly assisted over 300 families since its inception. We have purchased and renovated 17 properties, established job training programs, and created a network of support services that extends across New England. But this is only the beginning of what is possible." Richard was examining the financial reports spread across the desk. "Sarah, according to these documents, the foundation has been operating at only a fraction of its potential capacity. Your grandmother was being deliberately conservative, building slowly and sustainably." "There's more," I said, turning the page. "I have chosen Eleanor Whitmore to serve as the foundation's first independent board chair because I have observed her integrity, her business acumen, and her genuine capacity for growth. I believe she will guide you wisely while ensuring the foundation's mission remains pure." Eleanor looked stunned. "She chose me? But we barely knew each other." I smiled, remembering something my grandmother had told me months before she passed away. She said she had been watching Marcus's family for years, trying to understand what kind of people they were. She wanted to know if you would be good partners for this work. She was evaluating us, Marcus said with amazement. All those awkward family dinners, all those times she asked such pointed questions about our values and priorities. "And apparently we passed her test," Eleanor said softly. Tyler had found something else on the desk, a large map of New England marked with red ends. "What are all these dots for?" Brad studied the map more closely. "These appear to be locations where the foundation already owns properties or has identified potential expansion sites." I walked over to examine the map and felt my breath catch. There were pins in Boston, Worcester, Springfield, Hartford, New Haven, Providence, and at least a dozen smaller cities throughout the region. "She was planning a regional network," I said, the scope of her vision finally becoming clear. Not just Boston. She wanted to create emergency housing resources throughout New England. Eleanor was reading through more of the documents. "According to this strategic plan, she projected being able to assist over 2,000 families per year at full capacity." 2,000 families, Victoria repeated in awe. The magnitude of what my grandmother had envisioned was staggering. This wasn't just about giving away money or even helping a few dozen families. She had been planning to create a comprehensive support system that could break cycles of homelessness and poverty for thousands of people. But there was something else in her letter that made me pause. The foundation will require not just financial resources, but emotional commitment from its leadership. This work is not glamorous. You will meet families at their lowest points, witness suffering that seems insurmountable, and sometimes fail, despite your best efforts. But you will also witness the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit and the transformative power of hope. I looked up from the letter to find everyone watching me intently. "She's right," I said quietly. "This is going to be harder than any of us imagined." Richard nodded seriously. "The financial and legal complexities alone will be enormous. And that's before we even consider the emotional challenges of working directly with families in crisis." Tyler, who had been quietly listening to the adult conversation, suddenly spoke up with the clarity that only children possess. "But if it's hard, that means it's important, right? That's what my teacher says. The most important things are usually the hardest." Eleanor walked over and knelt down to Tyler's eye level. "Tyler, you are absolutely right. And I think your great-aunt Sarah's grandmother would have liked you very much." As we spent the rest of the afternoon going through my grandmother's carefully organized files, I began to understand that what I had inherited was not just money or property, but a legacy of service that had been decades in the making. 6 months later, I stood in the conference room of the newly established Morrison Family Foundation headquarters, watching as our first board meeting came to order. The room buzzed with nervous energy as Eleanor called the meeting to begin, her transformation from dismissive mother-in-law to passionate foundation chair still remarkable to witness. "Ladies and gentlemen," Eleanor announced, "I'm pleased to report that the Morrison Family Foundation has officially received its federal tax-exempt status and is ready to begin operations." Around the table sat an unlikely collection of people who had become my chosen family in this endeavor. Victoria had taken a leave of absence from her investment banking job to serve as our chief financial officer. Brad had joined as our legal counsel, navigating the complex regulatory requirements with the same precision he applied to corporate mergers. Even Tyler, now 9 years old, attended our meetings as our junior advisor, a role Eleanor had created specifically for him. But the real surprise was Richard, who had thrown himself into the operational side of the foundation with an enthusiasm that shocked everyone, including himself. He had spent weeks visiting existing homeless shelters and speaking with social workers, learning about the real challenges facing families in crisis. "Our first quarterly report shows remarkable progress," Victoria announced, consulting her carefully prepared charts. "We've successfully renovated 4 properties in Boston, 2 in Worcester, and 1 in Springfield. All 7 facilities are now operational and at full capacity." The numbers were encouraging, but what mattered more to me were the stories behind those numbers. Like Maria Santos, a single mother of 3 who had been evicted after her ex-husband stopped paying child support. The foundation had provided her family with a 2-bedroom apartment while she completed a nursing program. Last month, she had moved into her own place and started working at Boston General Hospital. "There's something else we need to discuss," Eleanor said, her tone becoming more serious. "We've received an unexpected offer that could significantly expand our reach." She opened a folder and pulled out a formal-looking document. "The state of Massachusetts has approached us about partnering on a statewide initiative to address family homelessness. They're offering to match our funding dollar for dollar if we agree to establish facilities in 10 additional cities." The room fell silent as everyone processed the implications. A statewide partnership would mean helping thousands more families, but it would also mean managing a much larger, more complex operation. "What would that look like practically?" I asked. Brad consulted his notes. "We would need to hire approximately 50 additional staff members, establish regional offices, and coordinate with existing state social services. The administrative complexity would increase exponentially. Richard leaned forward. But the impact would be extraordinary. We could help every homeless family in Massachusetts. I looked around the table at these people who had become so much more than business partners. What does everyone think? Tyler raised his hand with the seriousness of someone twice his age. I think Great Aunt Sarah's grandmother would want us to help as many families as possible. Victoria smiled at her son's declaration. Tyler makes a good point, but we need to be realistic about our capacity. Growing too fast could compromise the quality of our services. What if we approached it gradually? Eleanor suggested. Accept the partnership, but implement it over 3 years instead of 1. Build our capacity systematically while maintaining our standards. As we discussed the details, I found myself thinking about that Christmas morning when everything had changed. The wooden jewelry box that Tyler had opened was now displayed in our foundation offices, serving as a reminder of how small gestures can have enormous consequences. The meeting continued for another hour as we worked through logistics, timelines, and budget projections. But my mind kept drifting to the families we were already serving and the thousands more we could potentially help. After the others left, Eleanor and I remained in the conference room, looking out at the Boston skyline. Through the large windows. Sarah, she said quietly, I owe you an apology that goes far beyond what I said that Christmas morning. I turned to face her, surprised by the emotion in her voice. I spent years judging you based on superficial things. Your job, your clothes, your gifts. I completely missed seeing who you really were. Eleanor, you don't need to. Yes, I do, she interrupted gently. Because I want you to understand how much this experience has changed me. Changed all of us. She walked over to where Tyler had left his drawing from today's meeting. A colorful picture of families moving into new homes, with the Morrison Foundation logo carefully copied in crayon at the bottom. 6 months ago, my biggest concern was whether the country club's tennis tournament would raise enough money for new locker room fixtures. Now I spend my days figuring out how to help families rebuild their lives. I've never felt more useful or more fulfilled. Through the window, I could see one of our first housing facilities across the street. The afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the playground where children were playing while their parents attended job training sessions inside. You know what the strangest part is? I said. I thought giving away the inheritance would feel like a sacrifice, but it's been the opposite. I've gained so much more than I've given up. Eleanor nodded. Your grandmother was wiser than any of us realized. She knew that money could be a burden or a blessing, depending on how it's used. Speaking of my grandmother, I said, reaching into my desk drawer, I found something last week while going through her personal papers. I pulled out a small leather-bound journal and opened it to a page I had bookmarked. Listen to this entry from 2 years ago. I had dinner with the Whitmore family again last night. Eleanor can be difficult, but I see genuine intelligence and capability beneath her social pretensions. Richard has more heart than he shows. Victoria works hard, but lacks purpose beyond accumulation. The young man, Marcus, has chosen well in his work and in his choice of partner. Sarah will need strong allies for what lies ahead. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. She was planning this for years. All those dinner invitations, all those pointed questions about our values and priorities. She was assembling a team, I agreed, making sure the foundation would have the right leadership when the time came. A knock at the door interrupted our conversation. Marcus entered, followed by a woman I didn't recognize. Sarah, I'd like you to meet Dr. Jennifer Walsh. She's the Director of Family Services for the City of Hartford. She's here about the Connecticut expansion proposal. Dr. Walsh stepped forward with a warm smile. Ms. Morrison, I've been following your foundation's work with great interest. We have over 300 families on our emergency housing waiting list. Your model could transform how we address family homelessness in our city. As we began discussing the possibilities for expansion, I realized that my grandmother's vision was continuing to grow beyond anything she had originally imagined. The small wooden jewelry box that had started this journey now represented something much larger, a network of hope and support that was spreading across New England. Later that evening, as I sat in my apartment grading papers from my students, I thought about the strange path that had brought me here. I was still teaching. That hadn't changed. But now my work extended far beyond the classroom. My phone buzzed with a text from Tyler. "Aunt Sarah, I drew a picture of all the families we're going to help. Mom says it might take 100 years to help them all. Is that okay?" I smiled as I typed back, "Tyler, helping people is never finished. That's what makes it so important." The wooden jewelry box sat on my bookshelf, a reminder that sometimes the smallest gifts carry the greatest possibilities. My grandmother had given me more than money or property. She had given me a purpose that would last a lifetime, and it had all started with a simple Christmas morning when my in-laws snickered at a tiny gift, not knowing they were about to discover a deed that would change everything. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.